So now I'm all ready to go ahead and sew my pieces together and put the grid on it. And what I've gone ahead and done is put my walking foot on my machine and inserted a size 90 needle for quilting. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is sew up these two pieces, my velvet and the quilting fabric, using the edge of the velvet as a guide. I'm going to sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So go ahead and sew everything up. Alright, and go ahead and raise your presser foot and cut your threads. And then what you're going to go ahead and do is do the exact same thing to the other side. A 1/2 inch seam allowance. Raise your presser foot, cut and trim your threads, and now what I'm going to go ahead and do is insert a quilting guide into my walking foot. And the quilting guide is something that will enable you to get perfect parallel lines of stitching. And what I'm going to do is slide this in right to the 1 inch marking on my sole plate. And so what you do, and you can go ahead and trim your threads now or later, whichever you prefer, but what you do is rest this right along your line of stitching that you want to sew a parallel line of stitching to. And that will make a little bit more sense as I begin to sew. But go ahead and just sew right up. Trim your threads, and then just keep sewing. And make sure when you finish your line of sewing, make sure you sew beyond your seam allowance. But what you're going to go ahead and do is just finish sewing all along. Alright, so once you have all of your lines sewn going in one direction, you're going to go ahead and use the other line of sewing for the seam allowance and sew in the other. And this will create the diamond pattern. So once you've gone ahead and put your grid on, the next thing you need to do is take your pieces and split them in. There should be 7 of them, and take 3 and set 4 aside. And so what you're going to do with these, front sides together, so you'll have your quilting cottons. And you don't even need to pin this if you're really good, if you're really careful, but you can if you want. You can certainly pin. And I might even and so what you'll do is once you have this all pinned, is you'll sew it up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so what should happen is when you sew it up with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you can keep your quilting guide on for this, or actually you can take it off, you don't need it anymore. Just make sure you can see your line. What should happen is you'll sew over your first line of stitching using the edge of velvet as a guide. So what will happen is that line of stitching will disappear, even though if it showed it wouldn't matter because it would match perfectly with the grid. But you'll get a very nice, and you can set your needle down at any time just to keep your needle in the fabric when you need to take a break. And there you have one segment, and then you'll take this one and you'll attach 3 going in one direction, and you'll attach 4 going in another. So here is my second. So there you have it. Here is your tree skirt. And let me just show you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my serger and use a 4-thread overlock. And so what I'm going to do is put Ruby away, and I'll go get my serger, and I'll be right back. So what I've got right here is my serger. And I've set it to a 4-thread overlock and 4 threads of integrity. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and start at one side with these raw edges of the seams. Right here when you open it up, this raw edge that we just created, and just clean it up. Press your foot and work your fabric underneath. And then what you can do first, just to make sure your serger is threaded correctly, is just chain off a little bit. Make sure it's creating a chain, and it is, beautifully. So then just go ahead. And you're just going to be trimming off a little bit. Go ahead and raise your presser foot if you see it's not feeding correctly right at the beginning. Lower it. Once it goes through, there we go. And when you get to the end, just keep going. Right here, just go ahead and cut that. And now what you're going to do is go ahead and work your way and see how nice and beautiful and cleaned up the edges. And you can go ahead and take this and just trim it a little bit. You don't have to worry about the ends because you're going to catch those in the seam binding. So go ahead and serge each and every one of those and there you have it. See how nice and secure and beautiful and finished and professional those serged seams are. And then the last thing you need to do is put the seam binding on. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is put my serger away and clean up a little bit and get ready to put the seam binding on.